In certain towns across the American West, a single individual comes to define the standard for all others. This isn't something they pursue or put on, but rather something intrinsic to their being. A certain blend of warmth, reliability, or sheer unmistakable presence causes people for 50 miles around to always know exactly where that person stands in any gathering. During the summer of 1,883 inches crestfall, Wyoming, that individual was Rose Callahan. At 26, she was the oldest daughter of the proprietor of the local general store. By day, her blonde hair remained pinned up, and her eyes shifted between green and gray depending on the lighting. Her warmth came without weakness. Her humor never carried cruelty, and she possessed that unique capability common among frontier women who never had the option to be anything else. Every unmarried man in Crestfall County had pondered the matter of Rose Callahan, and most had gone beyond mere pondering. Formal wooings had occurred, bouquets had been left on the counter, and invitations to dances and Sunday dinners were common. Apparently, a rancher from Ridgeline once made her father a financial offer so surprising that Daniel Callahan placed his coffee cup down with great deliberation before giving an answer. Rose turned down every one of them with warm politeness. Her sincerity made each refusal even harder to bear, since there was no chill in it to provoke resentment. Speculation abounded. She was overly selective, she was holding out for a man from the city, or she had made a secret pledge. Not a single theory was accurate. The truth was far more straightforward and far more awkward, and it came with a name. That name was Will Hadley, the one man in Crestfall who had never even considered making an attempt. Yet nobody, including Will himself, realized that the clock was starting to wind down. At 30 years old, Will Hadley managed the livery stable located at the southern end of Crestfall's main thoroughfare. He wasn't the wealthiest man in Crestfall, nor the most attractive, although he was by no means plain. With dark hair, a chiseled jaw as if cut by a carpenter's square, and hands perpetually roughened by labor, he had a solid appearance. His smile crept in gradually and lingered. Fellow men often called him dependable, a word that can be praise or a tactful label for being unexceptional, depending on the speaker. But Will Hadley was, beyond doubt, a good man, not in any showy manner, but in a quiet one. He recalled what others told him and charged fair rates. 2 winters back, when Pete Marsh's barn went up in flames, Will arrived the following morning carrying lumber he could scarcely afford to part with and never said a word about it afterwards. Rose and he had been raised only 3 streets away from each other, sharing that effortless, unconsidered closeness of people who have always existed in each other's surroundings. He viewed Rose Callahan the way one regards the mountains through the window, knowing they are remarkable and feeling thankful they are present. Yet he never fully grasped that those mountains could be approached. On a June Wednesday morning, he stopped by the general store to buy nails and rope, and discovered Rose rearranging the shelf of dry goods. Perched on a step stool, she was wholly absorbed in reaching the upper ledges. "Morning, Rose," he greeted her, just as he had countless times before. "Morning, Will," she replied in the manner she'd used 1,000 times. He settled the cost of his purchases and departed. Out on the boardwalk, George Alcott, who had been turned down by Rose twice and had grown philosophical about it, glanced at Will and gave a slow shake of his head. "You know," George remarked, "for someone who deals with horses all day, you've got an astonishing knack for missing what's staring you in the face." Will regarded him with true confusion. "What do you mean?" George turned his gaze upward. "Nothing," he said. "Not a thing." Yet George was mulling over something Will was still unaware of. Edward Marsh, the wealthiest ranch owner in the county, had been discreetly making inquiries. For the last fortnight, those inquiries concerned Rose Callahan's serious ones, the sort of man poses before approaching with an official proposal. The Crestfall Midsummer Dance took place on the 3rd Friday of July, in the barn located behind the feed store. Rose had little desire to attend, yet her mother devoted 3 days to making her dress. Her father had already mentioned to half of Crestfall that she would be present, so she arrived wearing the cream-colored gown trimmed with lace. With her hair perfectly arranged, she carried herself with the poise of a woman who knows how to accept unselected circumstances gracefully. Within minutes, men began asking her to dance. She agreed to a few dances simply because declining would seem rude, and she spent the night offering the same sincere, heartfelt focus she gave to everything. An hour into the gathering, Edward Marsh arrived. He was 42, with a broad build, carrying the unspoken authority of someone used to being the most significant figure in any space. He came through the door. From nothing, he had constructed the biggest cattle enterprise in the county, earning respect even from those who didn't care for him personally. When he requested a dance from Rose, she said yes. Since turning him down would have created a stir, and Rose never created a stir, she joined him on the floor. He danced well. She also observed him studying her with the measured, appraising gaze of someone reaching a conclusion not cruel, simply methodical. He was the type of man who, upon making up his mind, never reversed it. At the far side of the barn, Will showed up tardy, a little dusty from his work at the stable, and grabbed a drink from the refreshments. Then he settled against the wall with that relaxed posture of a man content to simply observe everything. Watching Rose dance with Marsh, he had a vague sense that she was simply enduring it. Across the room, she caught his eye and smiled, not the polite smile she'd worn all night, but the quick, private one meant only for him. It vanished before anyone could take note. He returned the smile. But then Tom Fletcher was suddenly at his side, eager to discuss a horse deal, and Will shifted his focus with the careless ease of a man who didn't realize what he just let slip away. Across the room, Rose watched him turn aside. Turning back to Edward Marsh, she saw him watching her with that same meticulous, deliberate gaze. For the first time, she let herself feel something she'd never allowed before. The first cold edge of knowing that waiting might cost her more than she had planned. 3 days after the dance, as Rose hung laundry in the yard, Daniel Callahan sat on the porch and said, "Edward Marsh came by yesterday." Rose kept hanging clothes. "He comes in most weeks, though he never buys anything." Daniel paused. "He asked about you, how you were getting on, whether you had any particular attachments." Another pause, the sort of questions a man asks before he makes a formal proposal. Rose's hands slowed on the sheet she was pinning. "He's a serious man," Daniel said carefully. "Respectable. The Marsh operation is the most successful in the county." He fell quiet for a moment. "I told him you make your own choices, which is true." He looked at his daughter. "I just thought you should know." Rose finished with the sheet and picked up another. "Papa," she said, "do you know why I have turned down every man that asked? I have a suspicion. It involves Will Hadley." "It does." She paused a moment. "He doesn't see it. I've waited 2 years for him to see it. And she broke off and started again. "He looks at me the way he looks at the mountains, like something beautiful he believes he could never actually have." Daniel was quiet. "Edward Marsh is a decent man," Rose said. "And if Will doesn't—" She stopped again. "How long will you wait?" her father asked gently. She looked at the mountains beyond the town. "Those mountains will never be too far to walk toward." "Not much longer," she said softly. And for the first time, she truly meant it. On Monday morning, George Alcott found Will at the livery and got straight to the point. "Edward Marsh is going to make a formal offer for Rose Callahan, probably within the month." Will was examining a horse's shoe. He didn't raise his head right away. "Where did you hear that?" "From Daniel Callahan's clerk, who heard it from Marsh's foreman." George, who never had reason to invent anything, rested against the stable wall. "I'm telling you because you're my friend, and as your friend I say this with affection." He paused. "Every so often, the least self-aware man I have ever met will set down a horse's hoof." He straightened. "And what does that have to do with me?" George looked at him with the particular patience of someone who'd waited a long time for this conversation. "Will," he said, "do you understand that Rose Callahan has refused every man who has asked her for 6 years, and that there is a reason for that? And that reason is currently standing in a livery stable, acting as if he doesn't understand what I'm saying?" The stable was quiet. A horse shifted in the next stall. Will held George's gaze for a long moment. "She'd never—" he began. "She already has," George said plainly. "For years. And Edward Marsh doesn't know that, and if you wait much longer, she'll have to make a different kind of decision." He pushed away from the wall. "I've said what I came to say." He left. Will stood in the stable for a long time afterward. He was utterly still. The way a man is when everything he thought he understood has just been rearranged. Edward Marsh. A month. The hoof he'd been holding was still in his hand. He placed it down carefully, as if he'd suddenly remembered that some things, if you wait too long, stop being available. It happened 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon in August. Rose was walking back along the main street when she passed the livery. Will was outside working on harness leather, sleeves rolled up, hat pushed back. She stopped because she always stopped. Because any time with him was better than none. They talked about the heat, the Henderson horse, and the late summer rains. Then Will put down the harness leather and looked at her. He truly looked the way he occasionally did when he forgot to be casual about it. And something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before, not quite recognition, but something more urgent. He drew a breath, and before that courage could fade, he spoke. This time, he didn't joke about it or soften it with self-deprecation. "Rose, I heard about Marsh," she went still. "I have no right to say anything about it," he said. "I know I don't. I've had no right for a long time, because I never said what I should have said." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "But I need to tell you something before you make any decisions. I should have told you a long time ago, and I didn't, because I convinced myself it was impossible, and I was wrong." The street was warm and dusty. Someone was hammering down the block. She waited. "I love you," he said. "I think I have for years, without knowing it. I know that might not change anything, but I couldn't let Marsh—" He stopped. "I couldn't let you think nobody saw you, because I see you. I was just slow to understand what I was looking at." Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she took one step closer and said, low enough for only him, "Will, I've been saving my heart for you for years. I just needed you to show up," she said, holding his gaze until the words landed but not long enough for her courage to falter. Then she said, even quieter, "Don't make me wait anymore." And Will Hadley, who had never once imagined he could walk toward the mountains, took a step forward. "Before we continue, tell me, which country are you tuning in from today? Leave it in the comments. Knowing how far this story travels matters more than I can say. So let's return to the tale, because Will Hadley has unfinished business. The following morning, he walked into the store dressed in a good shirt with combed hair. His face carried the unmistakable look of a man whose mind is made up and finished with hesitation. Daniel, standing at the counter, took in Will, the shirt, the hair, and that expression. Without a word, he just called to the back, "Rose, Will Hadley is here." He heard footsteps, then she appeared in the doorway and halted. Her gaze met his plainly and directly, none of the guarded patience she had worn for years, only an unspoken, "So you came." Will said, "I want to court you the proper way, beginning today, and I need your father's blessing." Behind the counter, Daniel suddenly became fascinated by something on the shelf. "You have it," Daniel told the shelf, and Rose turned to Will. A quiet calm settled inside her, and the breath she'd held for so long finally let go. "You realize," she remarked, "most suitors show up with flowers." Glancing down at his empty hands, he replied, "I'll bring some tomorrow." "Will there even be a tomorrow?" "Every single day," he promised. "As long as you're willing to have me." She studied him a moment longer, then broke into a smile. It was the true smile, the one meant for him, and he finally realized it had been waiting all along for him to see it. "Then you'd better not be late," she answered. What followed was the most scandalous courtship Crestfall had seen in years. He arrived the next day with wildflowers not store-bought, simply spotted and gathered. She put them in a jar on the store counter, telling no one why, and the town buzzed with speculation. He showed up at the Callahan's house for Tuesday supper. Ruth had laid out the finest spread since Christmas, and Daniel made sure to be welcoming. Rose sat opposite Will, and their conversation flowed exactly as it always had, natural, laced with the same dry wit that had always linked them. But now neither one could pretend this was just neighborly friendliness. One Sunday in September, they rode up to the ridge overlooking the valley. The entire county lay beneath them, mountains in the distance, golden grass stretching forward. In the late afternoon light, they sat together and spoke about what truly mattered. "Why me?" he asked, truly curious. There were more eligible men. "Because you never put on a performance," she said. "Every other man who called was showing off something, his land, his wealth, his status. You simply showed up, unchanged, every time." She gazed at the valley, I always knew precisely who you were. That's far more uncommon than most believe. For a moment, he said nothing. Finally, he commented, Marsh is a good man. He is. You could have married him, Will. She looked straight at him. I waited for you not because there were no alternatives, but because you were the one I picked. A beat. Don't ask me to say it again. He stared at her, this woman who had kept something close to her heart for years, and now handed it to him freely, expecting nothing. He experienced the particular thankfulness of someone who truly realizes how close he came to losing it all. Beneath them, the valley gleamed gold, while the mountains stood as they always had. And something that had waited patiently for years settled itself beside him on that ridge, no longer biding its time. October in Wyoming arrives without compromise. The chill sets in quickly, the light turns keener, the high peaks of the mountains pick up their first snow, while the valley grass shifts from gold to brown. On an October evening, after the harvest social, he asked her outside the general store. In his breast pocket was his grandmother's ring, a plain gold band he had polished with care and carried for 2 weeks. He waited for a moment that felt sincere instead of rehearsed, then paused on the store steps and faced her. Rose, he began, I need to speak plainly. I've been vague far too long, and you deserve more than vagueness. In the chilly October light, her eyes looked green as she watched him. I love you, he admitted. I believe I have for years, which I know doesn't exactly speak well of me. But I see it now with the same clarity I have for the things I'm absolutely sure of, and I would be very honored if you would become my wife. A pause followed. That is, if you're willing to accept a man who was slow to catch on and is now trying to make up for lost time. Rose eyed him. Will Hadley? She declared. You're the most unromantic man in all of Wyoming, as far as I know. That proposal had maybe half the poetry the moment deserved. I'm aware. A silence hung between them. A cold wind swept down the deserted street. Yes, she said quietly. At last, after all those years of waiting, the answer that had always been in the wings was yes. There on the store steps, in the crisp October air, he slipped the ring onto her finger. She gazed at it the way you gaze at a thing you already know, not something new, but something that is finally, utterly yours. Their wedding took place in November, just ahead of the first heavy snowfall. The church was packed. Half of Crestfall reasonably believed they had a personal stake in the match and had earned the right to celebrate it. George Alcott, seated in the third pew, was noticed to be surprisingly emotional for someone who insisted he had no interest in romance. Rose wore her mother's gown, altered at the waist to fit her. She moved toward Will with the calm determination of someone finally arriving at a place she was always meant to reach. Will waited at the altar, watching her approach, struck by the sudden and absolute realization of how close he'd been to losing this. How could anyone stand beside something so remarkable for years and never truly see it? Edward Marsh had almost made the offer himself. If Will had stayed blind for another week, everything could have changed. He was not about to lose another day. They spoke their vows plainly and meant them completely. The years to come were built on honest work and the mutual warmth of two people who truly loved each other's company. They were always happy to return home. The livery business expanded, and Rose handled the bookkeeping. Within the first year, she realized Will had been underpricing his services. She fixed that with the same crisp competence of someone raised in trade. He chose not to argue, having quickly figured out that when it came to figures and logic, Rose was always right. Their son came along in year 2. They called him Thomas, after Will's granddad, a child who had Rose's eyes and Will's unhurried, thoughtful approach to life. Their daughter followed in year 4. Eliza was her name, sharp, brilliant, and witty, with that same dry humor Rose had always possessed. The house grew much noisier and far more vibrant. One summer evening in their 6th year, Rose was outside, hanging clothes. Will returned from the stable, still covered in dust, and paused at the fence to observe her. She hummed, as she always did during mundane chores. That July Wyoming dusk cast everything in gold, just as it always does, with the mountains unchanged in their steady presence. Will Hadley paused at his own gate, gazing at his wife. She spotted him and turned around. You're staring, she remarked. You never used to stare. I used to have no idea what I was seeing, he replied. Now I do. She gave him that genuine smile, the one he'd come to know. He walked through the gate and across the yard. He gently removed the laundry basket from her grasp and placed it on the ground. Then, in that golden dusk, he wrapped his arms around her. She leaned her head against his chest. Inside, Thomas and Eliza could be heard squabbling over something with all the fierce seriousness kids bring to such disputes. There are those whose stubbornness comes from both sides of the family. Holding his wife in the golden evening, Will Hadley thought of Edward Marsh. He thought about George's voice in the stable that Monday morning and how easily everything could have gone differently. He was grateful in the way one is only grateful when you fully grasp how narrowly you avoided losing it all. He kissed the crown of her head. "I see you," he murmured. She didn't need to ask for an explanation. She understood. She had always understood. She was only waiting for him to speak the words. Years later, when Eliza was old enough to wonder, she asked her mother how she'd known. They were in the kitchen, Rose teaching her daughter how to make the pie that had become a family staple. The question came out casually. In the middle of kneading, "How did you know Papa was the one before he knew?" Rose paused, working the dough. "He never put on a show," she said at last. "Every other man who approached me was trying to display something. Your father simply showed up consistently as himself." She paused. "And he was worth the wait." Eliza thought about that. "But you almost stopped waiting because of Mr. Marsh." Rose looked at her daughter, who had Will's eyes. "Yes," she admitted. "Almost." She passed the rolling pin to Eliza. "That's the part you should hold on to. Not the happily ever after, but the almost." She looked at her daughter. "Know what you want. Don't put on a show for anyone. And if the man you're waiting for is slow to catch on, grant him time but not unlimited time." A moment passed. "Eventually, you speak your truth. You give him the opportunity to step forward. What if he doesn't?" Rose was silent briefly, then said, "Well, then you have your answer, and you keep moving." She placed her hands over Eliza's on the rolling pin. "But Eliza, in my experience, when you speak the truth to the right person," she smiled, "he shows up." Rose waited, yet not passively. She didn't just sit around. She lived her life completely. She came as she truly was, each and every day, never pretending, never making herself small. And when she realized that time was no longer waiting for her, she spoke her truth out on that dusty road. Then she walked off, not even pausing for his response. That's no small feat. That required more bravery than any of Will's actions. Yet Will is no villain. He's something far more familiar. He was a man who believed wholeheartedly that something wonderful was out of his grasp. He didn't try to take it until that morning when George Alcott mentioned Edward Marsh. The quiet ticking of the clock suddenly became impossible to ignore. Sometimes that's what we need. What finally pushes us to act isn't the existence of love that was already there. It's the realization that love, like anything truly valuable, isn't assured to wait indefinitely. They made a conscious choice of each other at the 11th hour, but still within time. That's the part to remember. Thank you for listening today. Wherever you may be, I'm thankful you are with me. Until next time, keep writing.